Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Crisis in France. President Emmanuel Macron gives outgoing Prime Minister Sebastien Lecornu 48 hours to negotiate with rival parties, and a last-ditch effort to prevent the country from falling deeper into crisis. U.S. President Donald Trump opens the door to a possible shutdown impasse, saying he would negotiate with Democrats on healthcare subsidies, but only once the government reopens. And as the war in Gaza hits the 2-year mark, indirect talks between Israel and Hamas get underway in Egypt, and what is seen as the most optimistic moment for diplomacy yet in the devastating conflict. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Yasmine Farouk in Dubai. Well, once again, so much going on globally. We walked in yesterday. We were talking about political developments in Japan. That was a catalyst for equities there. Very strong performance and handover from Nikkei overnight, ending the session up 4%. But then, of course, attention turned to whatever was happening in Europe with the resignation of the Prime Minister, who'd only been in that position for about a month now, once again throwing into doubt what happens with future leadership in France and whether or not parliamentary elections are actually on the table. So we're going to be talking about that throughout the course of the show. But I will say, for markets, there's been one theme and one theme only, not just AI, but chip makers. Yesterday, huge story came through, another deal inked between AMD and OpenAI. So OpenAI obviously did that big deal with NVIDIA a couple of weeks ago, now also inking a deal with AMD. The stocks soared 24% yesterday. And what has that meant? Well, globally, it has meant that every other chip maker, anything that's sort of AI adjacent, has joined in the rally as well. So that's a big theme for global markets, continues to play out, not just in the U.S., but also in the Asian session as well. Lots of momentum going into semiconductors and into chips. Today, futures are tilting towards the red, down 0.8%. NASDAQ, similar amount. That I will say for the S&P, we've seen 7 straight positive sessions in a row. So remember, the U.S. is in the middle of a shutdown. It has had no impact whatsoever on where the S&P has been going, because day after day after day, it's been green. Same for the NASDAQ. The USD actually also surprisingly, since the beginning of the shutdown, it's actually more positive. So who would have thought a U.S. shutdown, political standoff there would be positive for the greenback? That is what has transpired over the last couple of sessions. The dollar is about 0.4% firmer in the last 5 days. And then 10-year yields, you'll see in the U.S. up at 4.15, taking their cue from global fixed income markets, which have been repricing higher, not least JGBs and France. Speaking of France, switching over, I do just want to point out, taking a step back, the massive underperformance that we've seen for the CAC 40, for the French index versus other global indices. This is quite clear. It shows you S&P, up 26% over the course of, well, this is what time horizon is this? Almost a 1-year time horizon. You've got Euro stocks up 9%, but then clearly underperforming there is the CAC 40, which is basically flat over the past year, and tells you that since the beginning of all of these political gyrations, investor money has not gone into the French index, despite the fact, by the way, and this is an important statistic to note, 80% of earnings for CAC 40 companies are derived from overseas. That being said, nobody really wants to be buying the French index here. Okay, let's move on and talk about markets in Asia. Min Lo is in our Hong Kong studio. What is going on the day after that very big climb in the Nikkei yesterday?
That's right. I actually didn't put up the MXAP, the regional benchmark here today, because we have many markets closed. South Korea, mainland China, Hong Kong are shut for holiday. And so we are checking the China futures trading in Singapore. It's pointing up, but largely, again, as you said, that AI adjacent trade that is pushing this rally in Asia. Look at the Nikkei, the TAIEX as well, up 2%. And again, OpenAI, whatever it touches turns to gold, right? After that deal with AMD, it's a lot of another wave of optimism, I should say, that is pouring into the tech sector. And take a look at the TOPIX non-ferrous metal index. This is a sub-index of the TOPIX, seeing a 5% rise, and is the best performing sector or sub-index in the TOPIX year to date so far, up 70% year to date. And again, it's that underlying demand for rare earths, critical minerals that would underpin, the growth of the AI data centers and electronics sector. But flip report, we're taking a look at the chip stocks trading today as well. TSMC, of course, up by 2.8%. Advantest as well. And flip the board, we're also watching Japanese bond yields because today there was a bond auction for the 30-year, the first debt sale after the election of Sane Takeichi. And surprisingly, actually, pretty solid demand, higher than the 12-month average. And that's got to be a sigh of relief for bond markets globally overall. And you can see we continue to see bond yields, the steepening of the bond yield curve in Japan, and the 30-year yield was close to a record high, and still that pressure on the longer end here because of Takeichi's win, the concern around the fiscal spending in Japan, and of course the yen also still above the 150 level as well.
Yep. Min Min Lo, thank you so much for the overview there. Right, let's shift gears and talk about what's been happening in France. The French President Emmanuel Macron has given outgoing Prime Minister Sebastien Lecornu 48 hours to negotiate with France's parties in a last-ditch effort to stem the country's political crisis. Bloomberg Daybreak Europe radio anchor Stephen Carroll joins us now from Paris. What a 24 hours it's been. What a past month it's been for the outgoing, or I should say, as it still stands, kind of still there, Prime Minister Lecornu. President Macron wants him to try again, perhaps to form a government in the next couple of days. I mean, what are the chances of success here, Stephen? Especially given there's been so much criticism about the cabinet that Macron appointed over the course of the last weekend. What political authority, really, would this new government have?
Well, I think in the short term, I mean, you point out what a week, and it's only Tuesday. And this is, you know, we're into another 48 hours of high political drama in France. And the question of what sort of even authority can be built very much remains in the balance. This morning, the meetings are going to start with Sebastien Lecornu, the outgoing or perhaps incoming Prime Minister, depending on what your perspective is. Interim Prime Minister, certainly, who's trying to get his former allies back on board. He's going back to the people who he already had supporting him, who had gotten cold feet over the announcement of the new cabinet. As you say, the casting of that cabinet has changed slightly since yesterday. Former Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire, who had been returning as the Defence Minister, has stepped back from his government role, so he won't be part of any new cabinet. But what Sebastien Lecornu needs to do now is to get the centre-right parties back on board with the budget plan, which of course we don't have full details of, but we know the discussions have been ongoing over the past month since Sebastien Lecornu became Prime Minister, to try and draw up the outlines of what they want to do. And that only would leave Sebastien Lecornu back in the same position that he was a month ago. He still doesn't have anything close to a majority in Parliament. So even getting those parties back on board doesn't necessarily mean that we will get closer to having a budget agreed. He's still going to need, at the very least, the Socialist Party to support or abstain on key votes to be able to get any sort of spending plan applied. The warning from Emmanuel Macron has been, if there isn't a deal, if there isn't a sense of stability by tomorrow evening, that he will, the words he used was, take his responsibilities. Now that can mean a whole manner of things, but the hint was that there could be fresh parliamentary elections, and none of those parties in the centre would do well out of those elections if we look at the polls now. And that's really the political pressure Emmanuel Macron is trying to apply with this new deadline, to focus the mind perhaps of those politicians and get them around the table to move towards something that might resemble a budget deal.
Yeah, and this is the thing, Stephen. You know, what is the incentive for some of those parties to sign on or throw their weight behind the new cabinet with the possibility of potential parliamentary elections? I mean, the likes of Marine Le Pen, she surely must smell blood.
Well, yes, of course, she personally wouldn't be able to stand again if there were elections because of the bar that she has for the embezzlement conviction, under appeal, of course, but the bar is in place for her from running for new office. So she wouldn't be part of the lists of candidates if there was a parliamentary election. But yes, for the Front National, or the Rassemblement National as they now are, that would be something that would be very attractive to them, the possibility to go to the electorate and have voters express their frustration, because there is widespread frustration with how the political situation is panning out. But of course, given the two-round electoral system here in France, it's also not clear that the National Rally would get anything close to a majority in Parliament either. it's very difficult to poll around this, so it would be unclear that you would end up with a situation that would be any less fractured if there were elections. But certainly the wave that had carried the Socialist Party to what was a relatively strong performance in the last elections, that alliance with the left has fallen apart, so that would be bad news for them. The centre-right Republicans are seen as being very much in bed with the centrist Macronist bloc now, so that could hurt them as well in elections too. And in a situation where people are facing tax rises, for example, they're not going to be necessarily very favourable to the centrist bloc either. So that's the political risk that Emmanuel Macron is trying to force by placing this short deadline. But the question of how long this can go on before we saw the jolt on markets yesterday with the announcement of Sebastien Lecornu's resignation, but how long markets would be patient for further negotiations as the budget timetable ticks on.
Yep, we're keeping a close eye on that OAT Bund spread. Stephen Carroll, Bloomberg's Daybreak Europe radio anchor, thank you so much for joining the show today. Well, switching over to the U.S. now, President Trump says he would negotiate with Democrats over healthcare subsidies in a bid to resolve the U.S. government shutdown. The Senate has rejected for a fifth time a House-passed stopgap bill to keep the government open through November 21st. Democrats say they won't support the bill unless it addresses subsidies set to expire at the end of the year.
We have a negotiation going on right now with the Democrats that could lead to very good things.
What kind of
and I'm talking about good things with regard to health care.
Joining us now is Lale Akoner, Global Market Strategist at eToro. Lale, good morning to you. Really good to have you with us on our show. I don't know if you heard the top of the show when I was walking through global markets and the fact that U.S. equities keep making new record highs. I believe it's 7 consecutive sessions in a row that the S&P has closed up in the green. So essentially brushing off all of the concerns around the shutdown. Why are global equity investors, or at least U.S. equity investors, not more concerned about the state of U.S. politics today?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amanda, for having me. Good morning. Look, I think the macro backdrop is quite positive in the U.S. Obviously, we now have the U.S. monetary policy easing. We are seeing around 5 rate cuts by the end of 2026. And of course, the fiscal bill and the effects of that is increasingly being priced into the markets, but also will be felt in the macro economy in the next few quarters. That includes R&D expenses for, say, healthcare companies that are very reliant on obviously expanding their innovation budget, but also for broader U.S. consumer, where we are seeing $150 billion additional consumer aid coming from those tax refunds from the next tax bill, right? So those are all being priced into the market, and we feel that in the consumer discretionary sectors, in retailers, home builders, stocks, and therefore the surge in these sectors.
What do you make of the most recent momentum that we're seeing in chip makers, chip stocks, anything, as we've been calling it, that's AI adjacent? It's been quite a remarkable run-up. Do you expect that to continue to have legs?
Sure. Look, I mean, obviously, the recent deals with these mega cap companies are quite positive. I think the concern here is obviously valuations and concentration risk. I think as more AI deals are struck, the market could become really more discerning, and only those with the real execution may be rewarded. So we really like, the more high quality and in the small and mid cap companies, the valuation there is much more rewarding in our opinion. And it's sort of like rebalance ourselves away from this AI theme a little bit.
Yeah, but at the same time, those top, let's say, 10 mega cap stocks account for about 40% of the S&P. So you can't really be trading the rest of the S&P if you're not paying close attention to what's happening to the Magnificent Seven and the newer ones, Oracle, Palantir, etc. So how does that influence the way you are adjusting your portfolio?
Sure. I mean, obviously, right now, yields are coming down, and therefore we are also seeing re-rating for these growth firms. what I would say is, again, make sure that you're not just losing on the average U.S. stocks. So equal-weighted S&P is also making new highs. As I said, there are ample amount of high-quality stocks in the, say, the more favorable valuations in, as I said, say, home builders, banks, consumer discretionary, retailers, which we think are going to outperform in the next few months, again, because of this positive, macro backdrop coming from the fiscal bill, but also the rate cuts that will increasingly be being priced into the market.
Yeah, let me just ask you a macro question. To what extent do you think the equity rally is contingent on the Fed actually delivering those 4 or 5 extra rate cuts that are priced into the curve right now?
I think that's a great question. I think the market is underpricing the inflationary pressures that could intensify in the next few months. The risk here, in my opinion, is that the Fed and overall, because of the fiscal policy, the U.S. could overheat the economy and therefore lead to higher inflationary pressures, and therefore the Fed might not be able to deliver those 5 rate cuts that are being priced into the market. As I said, we like short duration stocks that are companies that are high quality, that can generate cash about their debt obligations, even in an environment where we are seeing rate cuts coming, but you need to hedge for those inflationary risks. And I think being invested in high quality stocks is a good way to do that.
Okay, and Lale Akoner, Global Market Strategist at eToro, thank you so much for joining our show today. And coming up, talks over ending the war in Gaza are set to resume today in Egypt, as President Trump says a deal is very, very close. We got you the latest next. This is Bloomberg. Indirect talks between Israel and Hamas are reportedly set to continue in Egypt on Tuesday. An Egyptian official told the Associated Press that parties agreed to most of the first phase terms on day 1 of discussions, including the release of hostages and establishing a ceasefire. Let's go to Jerusalem now and speak to Bloomberg's Dan Williams. Well, it is the 2-year marking since October 7th. The war has been going on for 2 years now. So this also could be quite a watershed moment in terms of where we go to next. Of note, Dan, when Hamas put out their response, they talked about the necessary quote-unquote field conditions in order for the hostages to be released. Are we walking away with a better understanding of what exactly those field conditions are and how it pertains to the ongoing discussions taking place in Egypt right now?
I think field conditions, when Hamas speaks of that, is predominantly militarily, given that the Israelis control upward of 70% of the Gaza Strip. Israel has said that it's adopting a more defensive posture, especially in Gaza City, which has seen the most intensive fighting in recent weeks. This is meant to encourage Hamas to explore the area, locate hostages, prepare them for a possible handover, not just live hostages, but the remains of dead hostages as well. So this would be the proposed or the envisaged first stage of the Trump deal ending this war, handover of hostages. That's what's being discussed now. Trump, this is very much a centerpiece of his foreign policy. Predictably, perhaps he's been playing it up, speaking about a deal been very close. However, the public accounting from those talks at the Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh has been sparse. This is in part because it's a national holiday in Israel, a religious holiday, where naturally people in government would be less talkative. As you noted, it's also the 2-year marker for this war. So much of the public discourse is looking back as well as looking forward. However, there's no reason not to be optimistic right now. It would appear that as soon as those exploratory talks in Sharm el-Sheikh, as soon as the basic conditions have been set out for Hamas to deliver on its promised release of those 48 lost hostages, then there would be a upshifting of these talks. We would expect the top Israeli and U.S. envoys to join it. Then the question would be what remains of this Trump proposal to be discussed and implemented.
Yeah, perhaps pertaining to the more longer-term questions about governance and Hamas disarmament. Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem. We're going to keep a close eye on those talks. They continue to take place in Sharm el-Sheikh today. And still to come, a Trump-backed peace plan for Central Africa has hit a roadblock after officials failed to agree on a key economic pact between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We'll get you the details a little later. This is Bloomberg. OpenAI COO Brad Lightcap says the company is incredibly constrained in its compute power, and deals like the one with AMD will help build out more capacity. He also told Bloomberg about the importance of investing ahead to keep pace with demand.
We are tremendously compute constrained. It feels like we're in this kind of recurring theme of being compute constrained, and I think the reason for that is the answer to the question you asked, which is demand.
Right.
We see there are multiples of demand that are latent and untapped from what we have today, and even today, obviously, by any standard, demand and revenue growth has been torrid in its pace. And so really we have to invest ahead of that. And I think that's going to be the rate limiter for us to be able to go capture demand, whether it's consumer or enterprise, and for us to be able to build new models, parallelize more experiences, more product experiences, and then enable users specifically to be able to use those products more actively in their daily life, at work, and at home. And so, even things like Sora, the app we just launched, we wish we could invite more people onto it now, but we just need more compute. So the AMD deal, we're excited about being, directionally a way for us to do that.
I've got to ask about the report that OpenAI closed secondary, or the ability for employees to sell shares at a $500 billion valuation. I already asked you this question, but what is the metric we're supposed to judge your success by? The $500 billion valuation, the 6 billion tokens per minute? To you, Brad, what is it?
For me, it's actually kind of a metric that we talked about is tokens. It's you mentioned 6 billion tokens per minute on our API. That is the purest, for me, the kind of essence of utility is that consumption metric. And so we actively track that metric to see how people's consumption of AI is growing over time. And you see this happen in amazing ways. So things like Codex, for example, we've seen grow 10x since August, purely on consumption of tokens around coding. And you start to see that same pattern emerge across multiple lanes of use and across multiple areas of work. And that's the metric I look at, because if that number is going up, it means people are using us for more things, and that's the ultimate goal.
That was OpenAI COO Brad Lightcap speaking to Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow at OpenAI's Development Day in San Francisco. And of course, they're inking new deals with AMD and the likes. All right, coming up, we're going to talk more about the price action in fixed income with Amar Bashir. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Crisis in France. President Emmanuel Macron gives outgoing Prime Minister Sebastien Lecornu 48 hours to negotiate with rival parties in a last-ditch effort to prevent the country from falling deeper into crisis. U.S. President Donald Trump opens the door to a possible shutdown impasse, saying he would negotiate with Democrats on healthcare subsidies, but only once the government reopens. And as the war in Gaza hits the 2-year mark, indirect talks between Israel and Hamas get underway in Egypt in what is seen as the most optimistic moment for diplomacy yet in the devastating conflict. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Yasmine Farouk in Dubai, keeping a close eye on developments in France with Lecornu given 48 hours to try to cobble together a cabinet once again. But you saw quite an outsized reaction yesterday in French assets, especially with the widening of that OAT Bund spread. We're back at around 86 basis points at the CAC 40 tumbling in the session as well. So it is having a meaningful impact on localized European equity markets, but not so much the case for global equity markets. Again, the theme in the U.S. is strength to strength, 7 consecutive days in a row of green, of the S&P ending up in the green. Very strong momentum around those tech stocks, AI stocks, chip makers. The new deal between AMD and OpenAI was a big story yesterday. AMD shares soared 24%. So all of that is having an impact on global chip makers as well. Today, futures not doing a whole lot. The USD also trading sideways, though I should say that since the beginning of the shutdown, the USD has actually traded up. So we've seen some support come into the greenback over the course of the last 3 to 4 days. It's up about 0.4%. And then 10-year yields, we spoke about this earlier, but taking their cue from some of the global fixed income developments. JGB yields, we spoke about the long end yesterday. 30-year yields up around 15 basis points throughout the course of the day. We also saw a tumbling of French yields. All of that had an impact on 10-year U.S. yields, which are now sitting at 4.15, about 5 basis points higher. Now, switching over, just taking a look back at how the CAC 40, which is the French index, has performed versus other global indices. You can see quite clearly from this, and this is, all the way back if you go to the beginning of the year, over the course of the last year, over the course of this year, year to date, the CAC 40 really hasn't done that much, but you have seen a substantial amount of money go into the S&P, especially since those April lows. Similar theme for Eurostoxx. At the beginning of the year, we saw the broader Eurostoxx outperform U.S. equities. That has turned now with leadership once again moving back to the U.S. So U.S. exceptionalism back and forth, but not a lot of love for CAC 40 as these political questions continue to swirl. Okay, let's check in on how markets in Asia are faring as well. Min Lo is in our Hong Kong studio. Min.
Hey, Jumana. Yes, we continue to see this fresh momentum when it comes to the AI euphoria here in Asia, and the focus mainly on the TAIEX and the Nikkei because mainland China, Hong Kong, and South Korea are shut for holiday today. We continue to see a day 2 effect of the Takaichi election, right? It's starting to draw global funds into Japanese markets as well, and the non-ferrous metal index, that is the biggest beneficiary of the AI rally as well. The best performance under the Topics index year to date, up a whopping 70% from the start of this year. But we flipped the board. We're taking a look at the Japanese bond markets, and it's a sigh of relief today after the 30-year bond auction today, showing solid demand, better than the 12-month average. And interesting, you can see a bit of the flattening of the yield curve after the steepening that we saw yesterday. The 30-year yield had a fresh record this morning, but it's coming off those highs as well. We're also checking the yen. It's fairly steady today, the last I checked, but we can see the 2-day effect here, the big jump of about 2% yesterday. That was enough to rattle perhaps the Ministry of Finance, because we heard from the Finance Minister Kato today warning that the ministry will be closely watching any excessive moves in the currency space. But today we are seeing things fairly steady for now.
Yeah, it's sitting around that 150 mark. Min Lo in Hong Kong, thank you so much. Well, let's switch over to another market. French bond futures have underperformed their German counterparts in Asian trading after President Emmanuel Macron gave his outgoing Prime Minister 48 hours for negotiations to prevent a deeper political crisis. Joining us now is Amar Bashir, head of fixed income at Wealthbrix Capital Partners. Amar, one of my favorite sayings, my favorite quotes is Albert Einstein. He says the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. That's kind of the situation that President Macron is in right now. He keeps trying to couple together, a new cabinet with various prime ministers. It's not working. If he attempts once again to put in and appoint a new prime minister or to keep Lecornu in place, is that going to be satisfactory to market investors?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. When I was last here, it was just after the last prime minister resignation, and we talked about what would come next as a short administration. I didn't think it would be that short. That being said, going forward, I think here we are in the same place. The timeline here is a lot tighter because there's a deadline to pass the October budget.
Yeah.
I think in this occasion, we might move towards a different regime. So under French law, they can trigger Article 47 under the Deuxième Provisoire, which is a provisional 12th. Effectively, that means the budget is frozen for next year. They can't adopt any fiscal measures to cut the budget, but it allows the government to continue to operate, and that allows them to avoid early elections.
Okay, and what would fixed income investors do with that backdrop? At 87 basis points, are you adequately pricing for that risk?
I don't believe so. I think we still continue to leak wider until this is resolved. The move yesterday was significant, but still we're not at a point where the markets are forcing a different outcome. So Do I think he's going to try again? It appears he will try. The first the first option that he had is a resignation. I don't believe that's happening. So he will do what he can first to try and avoid snap elections.
Let me just ask you from a deficit standpoint. The reason we're here is because these prime ministers are trying to put through fiscal consolidation measures that are non-palatable to the other groups and other members in the parliament. There's no one group that has an overall majority. So they have to build together support for these fiscal packages. And I think what we've realized throughout the course of the year is that they've perhaps been too ambitious in terms of how much fiscal consolidation can get done. They were targeting 4.6% budget deficit. It will probably end up closer to 5%. Is 5% an acceptable number to the market? I'm just trying to get a feel for at what point fixed income investors will really punish France on its fiscal slippage.
If they were able to pass 5%, the market would be would feel instant relief.
Right.
So at the moment, it's about getting a budget passed.
Yeah.
The issue is that they need to work with either the left or the right. The right would naturally be the right side to help with budget deficits, but Marine Le Pen's party, as you said earlier, smells blood and is looking for a way to force elections and to continue to build on the gains that they had last year. So they're not going to help him at all. And then the socialists on the left are not in favor of these budget cuts at all.
Yeah. Okay, let's switch over and talk about JGBs as well, because we had a huge, again, repricing, steepening of the yield curve yesterday. Is that overdone, particularly because LDP, similar to the situation in France, they don't have an overall majority. They're going to have to get buy-in from other parties.
That's exactly right. I would say in Japan we'd be a bit more constructive. The moves yesterday were definitely very outsized. You don't want to go in on a day after a big election like that and fade on the first day. But as you said, she doesn't have a majority in the LDP. She also has had to rely on more fiscally conservative factions within the LDP. Former Prime Minister Asso is now the vice president of the LDP. So there's a clear acceptance that she doesn't have the ability to really have that much to maneuver on the fiscal side. Similarly, with the Bank of Japan, you're dealing with a 3% inflation rate, so they're not going to be able to delay rate hikes that long. There's an inflation problem that needs to be dealt with. So I don't believe there will be as much monetary and fiscal loosening as the markets initially expected.
Is there a trade to be done, though? Would you take the other side of the steepening?
Sure, yeah. I think, we favor steepeners across the board, really, except for Japan. Japan is the only market where there's actually a rate hiking policy, a rate hiking cycle at the moment. And also, the curve is already extremely steep. So, we always quote the 30-year yield at, 3.30, which is higher now than Germany, despite base rates at 50 basis points and bunds at 2%.
Yeah.
But also, there's a big dislocation further out the curve in the 35-year sector where you have bonds yielding close to 5%. So that is an incredibly steep curve. At some point, you have to fade that.
What does that do for real money demand for U.S. Treasuries? If you have, the appeal of investing in local GDBs at, close to 3.5% yield, does it make investing in Treasuries less attractive? Should you be thinking about that as a fixed income investor?
Completely. I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet, to be honest.
Right.
So, Japan has been a big buyer of Treasuries and still owns a lot of Treasuries. When you have these attractive yields in your home market, it makes perfect sense to start repatriating and investing back in your home market. I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet, but that is something definitely worth keeping an eye on.
Well, that's why we bring it up on Horizons. You heard it here first, everybody. Amar, thank you so much. Really good to chat to you about fixed income. Amar Bashir, head of fixed income at Wealthbrix Capital Partners. All right, coming up, indirect talks set to continue in Egypt between Israel and Hamas as President Trump presses for a deal to end the war in Gaza. We speak to Yasmine Farouk from the International Crisis Group next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. As the war in Gaza hits the 2-year mark, indirect talks between Israel and Hamas have begun. The Sharm el-Sheikh meetings mark the most optimistic moment for diplomacy yet in the conflict that has devastated the Palestinian enclave and destabilized much of the Middle East. Joining us now is Yasmine Farouk, Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Project Director at the International Crisis Group. Yasmine, do you believe this is the closest that we have come to a major diplomatic breakthrough since the beginning of this war, which today actually marks 2 years?
Absolutely, Jemana. I think over the past 2 years, we have never been at a moment where all of the Arab and Islamic countries, in addition to the U.S., putting pressure to end this war, especially under the leadership of President Trump. And we know that President Trump, when he wants something, he usually keeps working to get it. So at this point, we kind of have an international consensus that also brought Israel to the table. So certainly, everyone hopes that it ends here, and there are all the ingredients for the time being, including the pressure on Hamas to accept.
So let me talk to you about the pressure on Hamas. What are Hamas officials thinking here? Because ultimately, you know, for them, this has also been an existential question about their future existence, and they would be signing on to a plan that would not include them in future governance of the Strip and would also require them to disarm. What is the thinking on their part?
The thinking is that also this is a moment, and that's very important to highlight, that where there is also pressure on Israel to accept some compromise, and that there are here bigger fish to fry, which are the preventing the mass displacement and of the Gazans from the Gaza Strip, preventing the occupation of Gaza, and frankly preventing the death of the Palestinian cause. So as we see significant U.S. pressure on Israel as well, it becomes the responsibility, but also easier for the Arab countries to put pressure on Hamas to accept what is actually de facto the end of its political role in Gaza, but especially also some agreement on the arms, because we have seen also the terminologies on the arms of Hamas change from disarmament to giving the arms, putting the arms down, and giving them to Egypt, to negotiating defensive versus offensive arms. So again, that is the pressure is on both sides, on Israel and on Hamas at this moment. And I guess the Turks, the Egyptians, and the Qataris have made it clear to Hamas that this is the moment where they need to make compromise on their political and military future in this conflict.
Yeah. If you look at the text of the 20-point plan, there's one of the points in particular has been parsed at length, and that is the line about a pathway towards Palestinian statehood. Since then, the Israeli Prime Minister has repeatedly, and he said this around the UN General Assembly, said that there will not be a Palestinian state. He says we would strongly oppose a Palestinian state. It is not written in the agreement. Do you believe that if all sides sign on to this 20-point plan, that there will be a viable path towards a two-state solution?
I think this is what absolutely is needed if the United States and Israel want to go back to before this war, when Israel was on a path of integration in the region. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that is leading on this front, and this sentence is coming from that Saudi effort and from the conference that took place on the 22nd of September during UNGA, is adamant on having this pathway. And the United States is also determined that on the long run, there will be regional integration and normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Also, President Netanyahu has had to make many concessions. And if it's not the Netanyahu government, then it will be absolutely needed for any future government in Israel to make this pathway possible if it wants integration in the region, particularly normalization with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I will say there's one different element this time around, which is President Trump personally is very vested in this. And you can question his motivations, but he is personally very invested. But at the same time, it's coming on the time that the international community, coming off UN General Assembly, so many G7 countries have thrown their weight behind Palestinian statehood. Does that mean that perhaps the future plan for governance of Gaza is more likely to succeed because you have buy-in this time around from the international community and the United States?
I mean, where we are certain that we are the closest to succeed is to honestly, to end the war, but the plan needs extensive negotiations on the details. Even if we reach a compromise on the issue of disarming Hamas and on the issue of the future of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the rest of the details, this is just only the beginning to settle on them. And we have to remember that, again, the point that you stressed, Jumana, the U.S. leadership, it came right after Israel's attack on Qatar. So this is an exceptional moment for international mobilization. To keep the momentum and to keep the commitment, it is going to be a challenge, particularly for the Arab countries that are the most to suffer the consequences, but particularly and above all for the Palestinians who have been suffering over the past 2 years.
Yasmine, thank you so much for coming on our show. Really good to get your perspectives. Yasmine Farouk, Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Project Director at the International Crisis Group. Thank you. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following today. Shares of Halkbank plunged in Istanbul after the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the bank's appeal, leaving it facing criminal charges for allegedly helping Iran evade economic sanctions. The court refused to consider Halkbank's claim that it's protected from prosecution by sovereign immunity, and prosecutors say the bank helped move $20 billion in restricted Iranian funds and laundered at least $1 billion through the U.S. financial system. Turkey is in talks with the U.S. to jointly develop rare earth reserves in Western Anatolia, shifting focus from earlier stalled negotiations with China and Russia. The two countries are working to deepen cooperation from energy to defense after a meeting last month between Presidents Trump and Erdogan. It comes as the U.S. and EU intensify efforts to curb China's dominance in production and processing of rare earths. Coming up, a major setback for a Trump-backed peace push in Central Africa after officials failed to agree on a key economic pact between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. A Trump-backed peace plan for Central Africa has hit a roadblock, with Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo failing to finalize an economic pact as hostilities continue. Bloomberg's Andiro Ganga joins us now from Kigali. Well, this is another war that I want to say President Trump has taken credit for solving, but now we're realizing that actually the peace talks, the economic talks are stalled. Why did Kinshasa refuse to sign?
Hi, Jumana. So what we know so far is that Rwandan officials, DRC and U.S. officials were in Washington trying to negotiate the final text of a regional economic integration framework that is supposed to create closer economic cooperation between Rwanda and DRC to ensure that the peace deal that they signed in June has a better chance of lasting a little bit longer. But Kinshasa officials told their negotiators not to initial this agreement because they're growing frustrated, one, because M23 is gaining more territory in the eastern part of DRC, according to the UN, and Rwanda is yet to begin lifting its defensive posture alongside the border that Rwanda shares with the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this all comes after weeks of negotiations led by Mossad Boulos, who's the State Department advisor to Africa, where this economic agreement was meant to propose revenue-sharing deal from minerals that are mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, investing infrastructure, and also $760 million hydroelectric power project. But DRC is saying that they cannot go ahead and okay this deal in good faith if fighting is still happening in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are no concessions that have been made. There is no goodwill. Rwanda, on the other hand, say they're very surprised. This is a deal that was supposed to bring economic development between both parties, and skeptics are saying that this was a weak deal because Rwanda made no concessions going in.
Let's just take a step back, Andiro. Talk us through the underlying dynamics between Congo, the M23 rebels, the U.S., the economic partnership. You mentioned Mossad Boulos. How are those three shaping the balance of power and the potential prospects for peace?
Jumana, talks so far between M23 and the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo have slowed down because M23 again is not willing to make concessions. They're gaining ground instead of ceding ground. And there's this fear that if they continue like this, then economic and political actors are going to grow invested because they want to maintain that status quo. On the other hand, you have this economic pact that is being brokered by the United States, and they want to use political leverage to ensure compliance from Rwanda and M23. But on the other hand, the U.S. only gives you 15 minutes of fame. With the Great Lakes region, they only got 2 minutes because there's a lot happening in the geopolitical landscape, and President Donald Trump's attention has shifted. What Mossad Boulos is trying to do is get these two parties to sign this reef agreement so that he can use that as a hook for a high-profile meeting between Rwanda, DRC, and the U.S. at the White House. But theoretically, this could happen. Practically, these are countries that don't see eye to eye, and they only talk when they're going back and forth on Twitter. So that makes it very difficult. And what we are seeing is that very delicate intersection of peace negotiation, economic integration, and geopolitical maneuvering.
Bloomberg's Ondir Ganga in Kigali, Rwanda. Thank you so much for the reporting. Okay, let's round up the show taking a look back at equities. And we had a big day for AI-related stocks. Once again, yesterday, the big announcement was the AMD OpenAI deal that sent AMD shares soaring up more than 24%. So that is also lifting other chip makers. We're seeing it in the Asian session as well. A lot of momentum going through in semiconductors. So that rising tide is lifting all boats in the chip maker space. Anything to do with AI seems to be doing quite well. Brushing off concerns about the ongoing U.S. shutdown, though President Trump has signaled that he's willing to speak to Democrats, but once the government has reopened again about healthcare subsidies. And then, of course, we're keeping a close eye on political developments, both in France and in Japan, which have been affecting global markets. This is the picture. Futures in the U.S. leaning towards the red. European markets are flat. That's it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Johanna Versace in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.